friends. Thank you once again for being here. I would like to extend a very hearty welcome to our distinguished panelists. We have with us today the Honorable Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation from South Africa, Madam Reginah Mhaule. We have Mr. David Raskina, Managing Director of the Exim Bank. We have Ms. Kokitso Tlabenelo from A.T. Kearney. We have Mr. Peter Vowles, Asia Director, Department for International Development from the United Kingdom. And we have Mr. Stefano Manservisi, Director General for International Cooperation and Development from the European Commission. The discussion today is on, the title really is Africa First, Global Growth's New Frontier. I think we have been talking about Africa being the new frontier for quite some time. And I think it's time that we went beyond the narrative of Africa being the new frontier. And I think we have gone far beyond this. And in fact, I think we should go beyond the narrative of helping Africa or talking about the richness of Africa. So quite simply, the title should have been Africa First. Because there is much happening in Africa. They now have a 2063 vision document. And the crux of the document is that African development should be owned and led by Africa. We also have the historic Continental Free Trade Agreement. South Africa has just joined, and ratifications are coming in, and I think it's going to be a game changer. As far as security is concerned, that has always been seen to be something as an obstacle to growth in Africa. But I think things are improving. And once again, we have the narrative of an African-owned and African-led security. Democratic roots, certainly in the last year or so, have taken roots much more strongly than before. There is also greater confidence in the economies in Africa. And in fact, in the last decade, among the top 10 high growth countries, at least 5 of them have consistently been African countries. There is greater investor interest, particularly from the private sector. And many countries have enhanced their engagement with Africa in the last few years, just like India has done. We have had an unprecedented 29 visits from India by our president, vice president, or our prime minister. We are opening 18 additional missions in Africa. Our trade has jumped 22% last year. And our lines of credit, which is more than $11 billion, is spread over 42 African countries. And our Prime Minister, when he enunciated the 10 guiding principles, he mentioned that we seek to liberate Africa's potential, not seek to constrain its future. And that's really been our philosophy, put Africa first. So therefore, I'll straight away plunge into the question after these brief introductory remarks. Africa first. So how do we make Africa first? And can I just request the Honorable Minister to kick off the proceedings? Minister.
Thank you. Is it? Thank you very much. I want to, greetings to all. I want to start by just outlining the Agenda 2063 of Africa that the Agenda 2063 is a continental strategic framework for the socio-economic instrument of the continent over the next 50 years by the time it was started, which is now less than 50 years. The first 10 years of implementation plan identified the following flagship programs to be achieved by 2023, which are considered locomotive for concrete continental integration. That will be the Continental Free Trade Area, Integrated High-Speed Train Network, Annual African Forum, renamed African Economic Platform, African Passport, and Free Movement of People, Single African Air Transport Markets, establishment of African financial institutions, Pan-African e-networking, African Commodity Strategy, Grand Inga Dam Project, silencing the guns by 2020, African Outer Space Strategy, and Africa Virtual and e-University. Those are the things that are part of the Agenda 2063, and this is the first phase of the implementable projects that needs to yield results. So a movement has been achieved on the African AFTA. So Africa has a unique opportunity now to alter existing trading paradigms by restructuring its economies to support value addition, industrialization, and intra-Africa trade. South Africa remains committed to building its regional industrialization approach more precisely with the aim to identify a few sectors in which other countries have productive capacity and identify opportunities for the development of regional value chains. In order to consolidate these relationships, South Africa is committed to regional and continental economic integration and is paramount. The realization of the tripartite free trade area and the continental free trade area are important developments in unlocking access to the African market with over 1 billion consumers. And also other issues of importance are the issues of peace and security, which talks to the 2020 vision of silencing guns in Africa. And Africa has achieved much because the number of conflicts has significantly subsided, and we're just dealing with few pockets of internal conflicts in our countries, and which we believe that will make the continental free trade area to work effectively, and the market will be open and grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. I think that's an excellent overview of where Africa stands and how we can look at the 2063 vision document and from that figure out how to put Africa first. Thank you very much for that intervention, Minister. Can I just ask Mr. Peter Wowels to go next?
Thank you. Yes, I think there's a real risk that by 2050, as Asian economies continue to grow at a remarkable rate, that extreme poverty will be focused largely in Africa, exacerbated by conflict, by the impacts of climate change. And I think that's not a given at all, but it's a risk. It's not a given because Africa will hold by 2050 a quarter of the world's consumers. Huge opportunities with mass urbanization, huge opportunities to innovate and leapfrog conventional development processes. And that's in all of our interests. Wherever you are in the world, it's in our interest that Africa grows and creates the jobs it needs and tackles the root causes of poverty and fragility. And I suppose there are three ways in which I'd say we need to put Africa first. First of all is continuing to meet our global commitments. So the British Prime Minister in Cape Town last year reaffirmed the UK's commitment to 0.7 of GNI. That's $14 billion a year of development commitments, spending. But more importantly, it's transforming the way we work together and work in Africa seeing African countries not as recipients of aid, but as destinations for investment, and seeing that and really challenging ourselves and the way the world thinks about investment, seeing it as a partner, or African countries as partners in our shared priorities. And the third way is thinking, convening new types of partnership. The needs are huge. There are opportunities to collaborate. It's not a competition. How do we work together? And there is enough space and need to invest and work together. So, for instance, India's offer is a good example, as we're here in Delhi today. India's offer, its experience, its innovation, and what it can offer African countries is fantastic. And I think this week, for instance, I've been here and been pleased to be part of launching 2 initiatives between the UK and India to work together on international development. So yesterday we launched the Global Development Initiative with RIS, and launching the Centre for Economic Diplomacy with ORF. Both of those being great opportunities to see how do we use Indian expertise, Indian partnerships with UK and international experience to build markets, to tackle inequality, to think about the future challenges, the future of AI and the future of work. And I think, great examples, for instance, how we together shape international policies. The Indian leadership on the International Solar Alliance is a great example where India has set the course, and how that might matter and work together for countries in Africa. So I think the kinds of partnerships we need to create have to be different. They have to be one of mutual accountability, listening to Africa countries' needs. They're all different countries, listen to their needs. But I guess most of all, making sure that we're putting development at the center of our foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, you mentioned about expertise, Indian expertise, and our capacity building has probably been second to none when it comes to Africa. And I still remember that we had an African foreign minister who came 3 months ago, and when he landed in India, he made a phone call, and we asked him, whom are you calling? He said, no, I'm calling my teacher who taught me in school. And he has retired and he has gone and settled down in Chennai. But the first phone call he made from the airport was to his teacher who taught him in school. And I was really touched, I must say. But it really shows the depth of the relations on this, on capacity building particularly. So you are doing a lot on development in Africa. So can I ask you to go next, Mr. David Raisina?
Thank you, sir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and talk about our interactions with Africa. As a banker, for me, it is trade and investment which really drives an economy. And in that context, we are, of course, proud to be the instrument of the Government of India, specifically the Ministry of External Affairs, in extending, monitoring, and administering the lines of credit which the Government of India has been offering to various countries in Africa. As a result, out of the 50+ countries in Africa, we are present in just under 50, either as a project financier, an investor, or as a banking presence. We've got offices full-time in 3 African countries, and these help us. Now, where do we look at the results? If you look at trade as an indicator, last year in 2017, Indo-African trade, it accounted for about 8% of India's total global trade, about 6.5% of Africa's total trade. Good, but nothing great. No cigar over there. I'm more impressed at another statistic. If I take a look at India's external investment, that is Indian companies, acquiring companies, setting up joint ventures or subsidiaries overseas, then as much as 1/4 of India's investment over the last about couple of decades has been in Africa. That, to my mind, is an astounding statistic and something which bodes well for the future, because ultimately trade is transaction-oriented. You're as good as the last trade or last buy or sell transaction. Investment creates partnerships, and as we get into investments with lasting economic relationships, these are far more sustainable than individual trade transactions. What do we need then to build this up further if this is going to be the answer to sustainability? Firstly, the local infrastructure, of course, where the lines of credit come in. We've had the pleasure of helping to build power linkages, power generation, transmission, distribution, roads, railway projects across the length and breadth of the African continent. And as a result, this has made business easier. Let me just illustrate with a couple of anecdotes because it's very easy to throw numbers. We financed a hydropower project in Rwanda. Rwanda, as you know, is landlocked. It used to generate power by trucking in diesel from the coastlines in the east and west. You can figure out for yourself the cost of that power by the time you figure the cost of the diesel, the cost of the transport, and then the generator sets which would run that power. Now you have a hydropower project, and it's a run-of-the-river. It's not a reservoir, no environmental issues. This run-of-the-river project, financed by a Government of India line, now generates 25% of the power requirement of Rwanda. 25%, it means a child who otherwise would stop studying when the sun goes down can continue studying, can look forward to a brighter future, maybe go to university someday. Which brings me then to the next point. How do we boost investment? Here there's a perception problem, and I think the previous speaker referred to that in a little bit. There tends to be a habit maybe in much of the world, including India, of looking at Africa as one monolithic whole. It's not African countries, it's Africa. No, just as Asia is a continent and Europe is a continent and the Americas are continents, Africa is a continent with 54 different countries. Each of them are at different stages. Some of them are fantastic investment risks. Some of them are not quite so. So we need to first of all identify and stop using this global label for that. This is definitely a risk perception, but the risk can be managed. There are agencies in the private as well as in the public sector which can address this risk, and to my mind, that is a strong way going forward.
Thank you. That's really very useful. Not to look at Africa as one monolith. Can I ask Madame Koketso to go now?
I think a few of my fellow panelists have done a great job at talking about what the opportunity that exists in Africa. I mean, Peter, you were talking to how much that, there's still untapped arable land and natural resources in Africa. The population and the demographic dynamic within Africa is such that the human capital could become a really strong strategic resource for the continent. We have this wonderful democratization that's happening in Africa with 12 elections this year alone, and a more democratic environment. So I think you're quite right when you say that it's no longer kind of a new frontier. We've moved on from that narrative. But when we look at it and how to take advantage of these opportunities, for me there are three things that we really need to look at in order to make sure that Africa stays first and stays in line with its potential in terms of development. First of all, it's the idea of the fourth industrial revolution. And I very much agree with David when you talk about infrastructure and the need for power and all of that. But we need to be very acutely aware of the fact that that is development within the paradigm that the world is operating now. And it is absolutely necessary, but the world is making a bit of a shift. If we take a little bit of a step back and look around at what's going on in the rest of the world, we'll see that funds are being thrown in Germany, in Spain, for example, into the fourth industrial revolution, whether it's from academia, whether it's building innovation hubs, whether it's changing even the legal structure in which companies operate within in order to deal with this new paradigm. Now, the risk that we're at in Africa is that we are now only catching up on the development front from an infrastructure perspective, making sure that electrification rates are at an acceptable level, but we're not really looking out to see how we can ensure that we're not stuck again back in the old industrial era once we've gotten that up to scratch. So for me, one of the things that we need to do from a strategic perspective as Africa is consider that, sure, we've got natural resources in arable land, but how do we position ourselves in terms of human capital, innovation, technology, in order to make sure that we still participate when the new world order arrives in a few years' time? The second thing, and David, this is to your point around trade and trade and infrastructure, Ms. Minister, and David, you spoke about trade. And without infrastructure, then we do not have trade. One of the problems within Africa is not that there is not a willingness to trade, but that there is a lack of infrastructure to support that trade. We're talking rails, roads, ports, but importantly, as David has echoed, which I won't repeat, is the idea of power. You know, the African Development Bank estimates that there's between 2 to 4 GDP points lost in the fact that we do not generate enough power in Africa to meet the demand. This obviously impacts things like your manufacturing sector, and if you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, then without consistent and sustainable power, then we can't even begin to have that conversation. Lastly, for me, the third thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of keeping Africa first is the idea of governance. Sure, there are 12 elections across the continent this year, but we have just had a coup attempt in Gabon a few days ago. So the question really is, how do we take this democratization of Africa and convert those elections and that democratic process into very efficient and impactful leadership? And this, for me, is where the demographic dynamic becomes interesting. Because once you have that open society and a very young population, then you start having to engage with that engaged population, that youth population, and start becoming accountable to them. The other thing in addressing that for me is the regional blocks. We've seen in the West, in Western Africa, how the ECOWAS regional bloc has had really good positive peer pressure. And installed positive peer pressure on each other, and kind of keeping an eye out on the next door neighbors to keep them accountable. So for me, when we look at Africa First, there really are those three things that we need to keep in mind. How do we ensure that we're not just solving a problem that's for today? How do we make sure that we've got the right infrastructure in order to enable the things we talk about in trade? And how do we make sure that we go just from having elections to ensuring there is impactful and insightful leadership on the continent?
Thank you. In fact, that's very interesting how that many of these strands are not coming together yet to make it sustainable. And that's very interesting, the point you've made. Can I ask Mr. Manservisi, please?
Well, thank you very much. I think that Africa First is increasingly a global reality. It's not, it's something that we have to deal with in an innovative way and in a way which is enabling, let's say, all of us to take advantage of this. I mean, we have to get out from a sort of approach in which we are talking about bilateralism. We are working in a global world. We are working within an agenda which is global. The Agenda 2030 is an agenda of global sustainability. So therefore, Africa is already first in this context. Now, from European point of view, I mean, Africa is first for us from many points of view. First, because it is our neighbor, big neighbor. Second, because it is first in our aid, for what is worth, 23 billion a year. It is first in terms of trade. We are the biggest trading partner with Africa. First in foreign investment. We are the biggest investor in Africa. And first also in remittances, the people to people, 21 billion a year of remittances. So it is already first. Now, the point is how to, let's say, change not only our European way of work with it, but to do it together. It's not just a sort of new unilateral formula, but rather how to create the condition for a mutually beneficiary, let's say, participation to the shaping of the global challenges, like climate change, like stability, etc. Now, what the Africans are doing is particularly important from this point of view, because without African initiatives, the initiative cannot come from outside, and teaching lessons. We are ready to share. I mean, the choice of the continental free trade area is a crucial one. But let's be frank, we know what we are talking about when we talk about integration in free trade areas. It means a lot of things. In terms of, first, political will and determination and leadership. Second, there is an element of hardware and software. The hardware is the infrastructure, the connectivity. I mean, the intra-African trade remain totally marginal in the global trade system, totally marginal. And this because there is not an internal African market. Now, this objective is one of the first priority for Africa, for Africans themselves. And I think that for all of us, in particular as Europeans, should be one of our top priority to work on that. But the connectivity is not only a question of physical infrastructure, where I very much agree that is also an issue of ecosystem. It's not just a question of doing things. But there is an element of software that we know. It means rules. It means, regulatory reforms. You cannot just decide to have a free trade area, better interconnected, which is necessary, but you need also regulatory framework, which are empowering private sector and people to move, to make business, to interact. So these are the two, let's say, areas in which we need to shift a bit our partnership. And even if quantitatively, you know, as Europeans, we are big and probably the biggest, I mean, today, I think that we have to connect with many others, India, for example, and in the framework of the BRICS reality, for example, to share experiences, and also to do differently in the sense of passing maybe from what we used to call partnership to what President Juncker recently shaped and offered as an alliance, which is even more intense than partnership. Alliance means to set together on an equal footing what are the objectives and how to reach them together. This is the big challenge, and this is the reason why Africa is first, because we cannot keep looking at that as if we're talking about a continent of problems. It's a continent of many opportunities. The growth also during the big crisis, which remains quite high in Africa, today close to 5%, you know, is important. But the quantitative element should not hide, let's say, the necessary reforms which are necessary in order to improve the framework of governance, which is the way in which together we can contribute to reach SDGs, you know, and the sustainability, because sustainability is the key word in my view.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's really a very interesting insight. In fact, many of you have actually preempted my next question, but then I'll just skip that and go to the next one, which is that how confident is Africa now about addressing its issues on security, issues relating to democracy and all that? For example, in security, I think Africa is slowly moving away, thanks to its own experience, moving away from non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries to non-indifference to other countries. I think these are all important shifts in thinking which is taking place on the security front with respect to democracy. We are having the elections in South Africa very soon, and I'm sure the minister is completely involved in these elections. And so I think I just wanted to ask you, how do you see these factors also impacting growth, impacting, for example, the youth of Africa? And there is a huge demographic dividend which is there in Africa. So how do these factors impact the youth? So I just thought can I just request Ms. Koketso to start off and share her thoughts.
Just on the demographics of Africa, you know, there's this wonderful thing that we always hear.
Sorry, I just also to keep it a bit short, all of you.
Okay,
I just suddenly realized that we started 10 minutes late, but
started a little bit
unfortunately,
late,
I'm not sure whether I can borrow 10 minutes from the next session.
That's all right.
Sorry, yeah.
You know, very simply, the youth, there's quite a youth demographic in Africa. We know that most of the world's population will be sitting in Africa in a few years' time, and wonderfully, a big chunk of that will be in youth. Now, how security influences this is that instead of then focusing our efforts on how do we upskill our youth properly, how do we ensure that there is enough resources to ensure that they are this big consumer market that everybody wants them to be, those resources are then kind of diverged into issues of security. So it becomes a lost opportunity, in effect. And we then get into that cycle again where you're stuck in a low-skilled and low-paid dynamic. So very simple answer to your question is that it has a massive impact on the population, particularly then leaving this gaping hole in what should be a middle-class consumption market and a human capital resource for the continent.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Minister?
When you look at Africa, Africa is becoming youthful. So which means even at a decision-making level, there is an integration of young people to participate. And those that are representing young people in the decision-making processes also have youth structures where every information is communicated to young people. So we see them benefiting a lot. We see them in other multilateral structures participating actively. Before we would come to any summit, we'll start with having youth discussions on the matter. So even on this continental free trade area and safety and security, they are there on the agenda of young people. So Africa, especially living in South Africa, I would say South Africa is taking matters of youth very serious. like now we're busy for elections, to be precise. There can be no list that will be accepted if it does not include young generation. So we call it generational mix in South Africa, so that they are part of that. And at universities, there are structures and there are dialogues that are taking place, especially on these international matters and matters of trade and businesses. They are there in the agenda of young people in South Africa and Southern Africa, of course, and Africa in general, where encouraging. Of course, there are other parts of Africa where elderly people are holding on to positions, not allowing young people to come in, even if the population and the demographics of those countries speaks otherwise. But we in the AU encouraging all leaders to make sure that they give space for young people to participate.
Well, thank you. That is pretty eloquent. Thank you very much, Minister. In fact, one of the things which the Minister had alluded right in her opening statement is on the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I was wondering whether I can then request, Mr. Peter Wowels, about how do you see the Continental Free Trade Agreement changing the face of Africa?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think just quickly on the demographic side, I mean, the sheer numbers are incredible. The 18 million jobs that are required in Africa every year between now and 2035, and that is a staggering figure. 50,000 every day. We're going to need to create, Africa's going to need to create. And the Continental Free Trade Area is a key part of that in opening up markets across Africa. And I think it's important to make sure we're not trying to fix yesterday's problems and seeing the world, there will be a new economies and different needs. But that young, dynamic youth population, the opportunities, some of them will be in manufacturing and the manufacturing that's been done in Asia that we'll hope would move to Africa. But it's going to be different kind of industries as well. But I think the Continental Free Trade Area is a huge opportunity. And it is possible, and I think the points about hardware and software are key. So the hardware being that the roads, the infrastructure, the ports, the border posts works smoothly. The software meaning the governance and the standards so that goods can get across the continent quickly and well. And there's great evidence already in that. Certainly in East Africa, the work that we, the UK, have been doing with Trademark East Africa, a company we set up with the East African community, has halved the time it takes to get a container around into the East Africa and around the region. That's a market of 220 million people. A market for Kenyans, for Ugandans, for Rwandans, and a market for Indians, Chinese, and for the UK and Europeans. So there's a huge opportunity there, and I think those experiences we can apply much more broadly across the continent to get the hardware and the software right to open up those markets and create those jobs.
Thank you. Would you like to comment on this, Mr. Manservisi?
Well, I think that the reality is, in terms of numbers, just to be clear, that Africa is passing from a labor market of 680 million in 3 years ago to close to 2 billion in 2063. Now, this is not a small element because the vast majority of this labor market is very young, is very potentially talented, is certainly, rich on potentiality, but then you have to create the condition not only to create jobs, but to create sustainable jobs and to put to the service of a sustainable economic growth this capital. So I think that this is a key challenge that must be, let's say, addressed with the smart project. The Continental Free Trade Area is fundamental, as all the supply side reforms which are hugely necessary in order to create the condition. But it's also necessary to increasingly, let's say, have Africa, let's say, vision on which kind of economic project and economic vision for its own economic growth. Because today, the 5% of growth is still driven too much by commodities and raw material export. And this certainly is not sustainable, not because it is right or wrong, but simply because it's not sustainable. The real issue of whatever economic, let's say, sustainable growth and job creation is the added value, is to what extent based on supply-side reform, like the big, let's say, free trade area and all what goes with that, infrastructure, vocational training, investing, youth, etc., you know, can be embedded into, let's say, a project, an industrial project, let's call that in this way, you know, which is adding value. You need a market, internal, but you need also a competitiveness in the global economy. This is the big challenge that we have. Now, from a European point of view, what we are doing now is to shift from, you know, the old paradigm, I mean, a lot of aid, 23 billion, etc., but to use increasingly this money, among other, in order to leverage private investment. If we don't work all together in order to share experiences, to mobilize private investments, profitable, not subsidized, profitable, then how to do it? Because the factor of risk which have been underlined, call them governance, call them instability, call it ignorance about opportunities, you know, must be addressed. And the market today, they're not addressing them. So what we are putting in place now, it is already in place, is a system for de-risking private investments, you know, and allowing those profitable investments, which are prevented by the high rate of interest to pay because the risk is too high, by the lack of knowledge of opportunity, and by the lack of, let's say, the capacity to embed this investment in a conducive environment, could be administrative, could be social, etc. We are now setting up this mix, which is the European Investment Plan, which is de-risking investments, and this producing today leverage 1 up to 12, I mean, in term of capacity, and addressing the key drivers, digital economy, urban sustainability, creation of small and medium enterprises, agribusiness with high added value, where we see short-term, let's say, I mean, dividend and interconnection, in particular renewable energy. I think that around this, there could be an agenda on which we can work all together.
Thank you very much. And before I turn to David, you know, Exim Bank has been very particular about how you give or give development assistance. I think you have insisted always that it has to be demand driven, and it has to fit the priorities of the African countries which you give to. And I think you're also, I think, giving it free of conditionalities. Yes. I think, and therefore in many ways you're literally not constraining the future but liberating the potential, so to say. So can I request you to make a quick intervention on some of these aspects before we open the floor for questions?
Sure.
A very quick intervention.
Sure. Thank you, sir. The point is actually very well made. It is the policy of the government of India which we intervene, that we are not taking a prescriptive stance towards financing of development. We believe that there are significant differences in philosophy, in conditions, in abilities across the various countries of the continent, and it is not for an outside party to prescribe or dictate what should be their development strategy. In fact, if you take a look at some of the pie charts you'll see in our annual report or on our website, which describes the industrial or sectoral distribution of the lines of credit, you'll find an incredible profusion of sectors, ranging from agricultural development to small industries, to large industries, to infrastructure, to solar, to job creation, you name it. Why? Because we go by what that country wants. If the particular country feels that its development strategy is best geared to going in this direction, we do not try to change that direction. We walk with them on that same road and see how we can help them on this. And I think that has been the difference between India and various other players in the African continent. The feedback we have got also is that this is significantly appreciated. Being outsiders, very frankly, we do not have the in-depth knowledge of what is happening in that particular country or the continent to try and dictate those terms.
Thank you. I think that's really useful, and I'm going to open it up for questions. We have about 8 minutes or so for questions. Can I just request you to kindly come forward, and I'll take one there and then I'll come to you. So you may have to line up behind the mics actually. I'm sorry to request you to line up behind the mics, but can I take one question from there?
Yeah, my name is Vasan, and it's very clear that in the continent of promise, there are huge challenges. I'm specifically referring to the figures that were quoted, about 8 million jobs to be created, or whatever in a year. So in this context, we did come together to create the BRICS Fund. How effective has been the BRICS Fund in channelizing the efforts of this community there for development of Africa? Because I think from America to Latin America to Africa to Asia, people have come together to create this. So what is the factual assessment on ground of how it has achieved its objectives?
I'll take a couple of more questions. Yes, please, from here.
My name is Aditya Bharadwaj and I'm a law student from Government Law College, Mumbai. Many leaders of the African Union have repeatedly raised the idea of a common African currency or the Afro. I would like to ask Minister Reginah and Ms. Koketso whether do you see it happening in the near or the far future, and will African governments be ready to, and their monetary systems be able to handle the consequences of a common currency, and what it holds for the future, the idea holds for the future?
I'll take one question from there before I come back here.
My name is Isha and I'm a journalist based in Germany. Thank you for the interesting session, and my question is open to all the panelists. It is true that a lot is being invested in Africa. There is a lot of direct kind of assistance from Europe, for instance. But what about the indirect kind of interventions that are also taking place? For example, a small country like Suriname cannot dictate its own terms and it needs investors. And there are Chinese companies that are making use of loopholes, coming into the country, cutting the old forests. They make furniture out of it, sell it in countries like Germany and the Netherlands. And in this way, on the one hand, we have Europe assisting Africa, and on the other hand, Europe is also part of the exploitation, if I may call it, that is taking place. So how do we get out of this vicious circle?
Okay, I'll come here. I'm just making, please make note of all these questions because you have to give the answers. I'm going to only moderate. Please, sir, please.
Vinod Sehgal, Executive Director, Eco-Monitor Society, which deals with the demographic ecological interface. My question is specifically for the two speakers from Africa. Why aren't the governments of Africa making efforts towards population stabilization? Because the rate of population growth is such that in every 35 years there'll be a doubling of the population, and therefore you can never reduce poverty. If you're not looking in this direction, what options do you have? Thank you very much.
I'll take one last question. Can I request you to make this question before I request the panelists to answer?
Thank you. My name is Sylvina Mhaule. I'm from Uganda, and I'm a researcher on human rights and peace building in Africa. And my question is for Mr. Vols and Mr. Stefano. Africa has lost an estimated $1 trillion over the past decade through tax havens, shell companies, and other illicit financial outflows. My question is, and most of these revenues actually return to developed countries, including Europe and specifically the United Kingdom. And these are countries that are collaborating with Africa on peace and development. So my specific question is, would the EU support an inclusive global tax governance framework to curb these much needed revenues from leaving developing countries, including many countries in Africa? And what initiatives has the EU, and specifically the UK, taken to collaborate with African countries in curbing these financial outflows? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll take one question from there. I haven't taken any question. This will be the last one, please.
Thank you. From the discussions, it's clear that the world is moving towards a multipolar kind of, if it's not already there. And my question can be addressed by any of the panelists. Because now in Africa we see different actors from developing world with sometimes competing interests and strategic partnerships. Now, what is their view that will make Africa become an active player rather than the receiver? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, we got a range of questions. We have, there is a question on the BRICS fund. And by the way, just for information, there is also an IPSA fund, which is also doing pretty well. about creation of jobs, common African currency, about correct and incorrect interventions, and we have got questions on the support from EU, from UK, a multipolar world, and about population stabilization. So I think we have a range of questions. Now, we still have about 10 minutes, so I would request you to address some of these questions from your side, and also use this for your concluding remarks so that we can combine both, and I'll request the Honorable Minister to start first.
Thank you, Chair. I think on issue of the common African currency, first things first. If we get it right on the continental free trade area, and we consolidate and our market and make it one, then the currency will be the next. I indicated in my introductory remarks that we are on the first phase of the decision by the AU. So we will be moving to the second phase after the thorough implementation of the first phase resolutions. On the issue of population stability, as Africa, if you can look at all the 54 countries of the continent, combined the population is 1.2 billion, and which is almost equal to a population of one country, India. So I don't see the population of Africa having any significance. It's just the way things are done and the way we conduct our trade and investment. That's what leads to the losses of jobs and systems that are not creating jobs in Africa. But as we come closer to Africa first, that will help Africa to create jobs for its young people. But generally, I appreciate for this panel discussion, and I believe that as we go back to our continent and our country and make sure that we implement all the resolutions of the AU, Africa will be the best continent to live in, and it will improve in terms of investment and trade. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. That's very, very inspiring, and I'm sure that you will make it happen. Thank you very much. Ms. Koketso, can I request you to?
I think the Minister has taken a couple of questions, so I'll go to the ones that I'd like to address. On the taking advantage of Africa, I strongly believe this is where the issue of governance and leadership on the continent is quite important, and this is where the youth demographic almost has a role to play in holding their own governments to account. We have, as Peter said earlier, we have long passed the point where you can walk into Africa and hope to extract and leave. We have to hold people accountable and have very clear rules of engagement for how business is conducted on our own continent. On the how do we become an active player in terms of the future economy, there are certain things that Africa then needs to do in order to make sure that we are sufficiently prepared for, say, a fourth industrial revolution. One of the biggest ones is upskilling and ensuring that there is enough skills levels in education, in technology. The second one is an investment in innovation. So we've had wonderful innovations coming out of Africa that have broken down business models and created entirely new ways of operating that are beneficial not just to Africa but to the rest of the world, the mobile money being a wonderful example of this. But these are things that should really have far more investment and far more focus on while we're still fixing the issues of infrastructure and so on. I think, in conclusion for me, there are really two parts of making sure that Africa remains first. The first is a very strong economical strategy, and that involves regional trade, that involves looking to the future in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, that involves ensuring that human capital is skilled and can play a part in the global economy. But the second part of that is ensuring that the social structures are put in place, and that comes from a governance perspective, ensuring that governments are held to account and they are providing those social services that ensure that this becomes an inclusive and broad-based growth.
Thank you. In fact, before I ask Mr. Manservisi there are a couple of questions on EU and UK and others, but I'd just like to make a short point on this, the so-called correct and incorrect interventions, which there was a reference to in one of the questions. In fact, we in India, we are extremely conscious of this. That's why we have these set of principles which we operate when we have a partnership with Africa. Apart from being, it has to be the national priorities, it is demand-driven. But in our more than, all over the world, in fact, more than $26 to $27 billion worth of lines of credit, the indebtedness, so to say, is as little as 40 million. And that's also something we are working on to make sure that make it even practically come down to zero. And that's quite phenomenal when you look at the fact that it's more than 26, 27 billion and it's just 40 million that we have problem of indebtedness. And that's partly, I think, because of the way we look at these issues, and we want people to own their development, and that's what we try to do. Sir.
Well, thank you. I think, time is very short. I will just take one point about the tax havens and, let's say, the exports, more or less legal, of capital from Africa outside in the world. I think this is a crucial issue because, we cannot, if we accept the discussion which is putting Africa first as a component of the sustainability or whatever project of growth and governance at the global level, the issue of the utilization and the raising of national resources in Africa is a crucial pillar. This has been set aside for too long, with complicities of all kinds. I think that if this problem is not addressed by Africans themselves first, there could not be any kind of sustainable development and growth just because of external investments or external action. So this is crucial, which is a crucial issue for governance, is a crucial issue for, let's say, sustainability and the credibility of institutions. So but this is for African first. What we can do on our side is precisely to be more than partners on this, cleaning up what are our part of responsibility on this, what we are doing, by the way, because, we are precisely, we are clean up all the European legislation concerning some form of complicity, but also we have extended some standards which are going beyond even the OECD one in terms of tax havens, which is not a pleasant story, all the time. But I think that is crucial to be done. Then I'd like to conclude just to say that, for us as Europeans, there is one element which must be clear to everybody in our societies, that success of Africa is a success for the European Union. Successful and sustainable growth, jobs, and, better condition of life for Africa is a condition for a sustainable success for Europe. This is a changing paradigm which we can drive a number of things in our way of working, in our engagement, but also in our, let's say, engagement and partnership with other actors. I said that again, but I will say also in conclusion, because this is a shared issue. It's not to work for Africa, it's to work for the sake and sustainability of all of us, and on this Africa is already a protagonist if we want to succeed, and therefore we have to work in a different way. And from this I'm very much optimistic, but everybody must have his part of responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Peter Bowles.
Thank you. A couple of points on the questions. I think on the indirect interventions and the and what the risks for Africa, I think we've got a huge amount to do together across the international community to work on the standards. So whether it be working with the Exim Bank on the standards of its investments, working on how, so that we get the environmental social governance right, as Exim is doing and others. So certainly it's not just about international aid flows, it's about investment and getting the standards right. On population, ultimately this is an issue for individual countries. The key thing for me is that we're making sure that women and girls have choices when they have children and how many children, and that's for them to make that decision. Ultimately, demography will come down to economic growth, and as we see in Asia, when people have child mortality drops, maternal mortality drops, family sizes will adapt, and that's a kind of part of economic growth and economic development. The really important point, I think, about making sure that we are not complicit, the underlying causes of poverty and conflict, the point about illicit finance, is really well made and important. We need to make sure that we are working in partnership with African countries on on illicit finance, on serious organized crime. I'll give you an example where I think that's beginning to work and we're really tackling. So in Kenya last year, a British company was prosecuted in the UK under the Bribery Act for corruption in Kenya. And it was prosecuted in the UK. The proceeds of that corruption, the fees they paid, we returned to Kenya. So I think that's a really good example of us holding a British company to a set of international standards and then returning those resources from the prosecution back to the country of where they had been acting. And I think we need to keep pushing companies from wherever they're from to make sure that we are all operating transparently and tackling those root causes. Thank you.
That's very heartening. Thank you. David, I'll ask you to go last.
Thank you for the last word. I'd like to just quickly address the question on jobs asked by the young lady. I'm fully in agreement with the Honorable Minister. Population is not a problem, but employment for that population definitely is a challenge. Now, the free trade area is definitely going to help in this area, but be aware that raw materials, commodities, natural resources dominate the export baskets of almost all the individual countries of Africa. So just having a free trade area across the continent isn't going to help much. Who's going to buy from whom? You need to have value addition within the African continent, within those various countries, for which you need investment, which I opened with. And can I make a plug for my industry in closing? You need domestic savings to be mobilized by an effective banking system. If you look at the development experience of India, it was the spread of the public sector banks across the length and breadth of the country and the specialized development financial institutions, the IDBI, the ICICI and others, which created the industrial sector of India. And it is industry, like it or not across the world, which creates jobs. Currently in Africa, it is agriculture and services which dominate the GDP, but jobs, paying jobs, good jobs for the future are going to come from manufacturing. So you need to develop a banking system which accumulates local savings, channels them into investment. Foreign capital will and play an important role, must play an important role, but you cannot hop on one leg. You need domestic capital as well.
Thank you very much. In fact, as the president of one of the African countries said rather famously, that Africa produces what it cannot consume and consumes what it cannot produce. So, but that things are changing. Things are definitely changing on the ground. And I'm convinced that as we approach Africa from the outside, we are very conscious of the fact that we have to put Africa and its own priorities right in the center. And that's precisely what the vision document does. And that's precisely some of the steps which the African countries are taking, whether it's security, whether it's in the economic field, whether it's in trade. I think that's precisely what is happening. And it's time that all of us sitting outside recognize this move and we participate in it in a way in which it addresses their concern. I think we all agree it's an absolutely fascinating discussion today, and I just wanted to give a big hand to the panelists for participating. I'm grateful to every one of them for taking time off, especially the Honorable Minister. Thank you, Minister, for being here. Thank you once again, and I think the next panel will be probably in the next few minutes.